In the marble corridors of the Spanish royal palaces, where shadows danced between golden candlelight and whispered secrets, there lived a child whose very existence would become one of history's most haunting mysteries. His name was Felipe Próspero, and by the age of 4, courtiers had already begun calling him something that would chill the blood of any parent: the Prince of the Dead Eyes. What you're about to discover isn't just another tale of royal tragedy. This is the story of a boy whose portrait would become one of the most unsettling images ever captured on canvas, whose brief life embodied the grotesque decline of an empire, and whose death would mark the beginning of the end for one of Europe's most powerful dynasties. The child you see staring back from Diego Velázquez's masterpiece wasn't just sickly. He was something far more disturbing. Today, we're peeling back centuries of royal propaganda to examine the true horror of what the Spanish Habsburgs had become by the mid-1600s. Felipe Prospero's story isn't merely about one doomed prince. It's about the systematic destruction of a bloodline through generations of calculated inbreeding, political manipulation, and the terrifying price of absolute power. By the time you reach the end of this investigation, you'll understand why this 4-year-old boy's existence sent shockwaves through every royal court in Europe, and why his death was both inevitable and catastrophic. But first, let me show you exactly what we're dealing with. In 1659, Diego Velázquez completed what many art historians consider his most psychologically disturbing work. The portrait shows a small boy dressed in the finest silks and velvets that Spanish wealth could provide, standing in an ornate palace room, surrounded by luxury beyond imagination. Yet something is fundamentally wrong with this image. The child's face carries an expression that no 4-year-old should ever possess: a hollow, ancient weariness that seems to peer directly into the viewer's soul. Those eyes, which gave him his terrifying nickname, weren't just unusual. They were the physical manifestation of genetic catastrophe, the visible evidence of what happens when royal bloodlines become so tangled that they cease to produce healthy heirs. Contemporary accounts describe Felipe Prospero's gaze as seeing beyond the veil of life itself, and even hardened courtiers would cross themselves after looking upon the prince's face. This wasn't simply artistic interpretation. Velázquez was renowned for his brutal honesty in royal portraiture, and what he captured in that painting was the literal truth of what Felipe Próspero had become. The boy was dying from the moment of his birth, his body racked with ailments that physicians of the era couldn't even begin to understand, let alone treat. His very existence was a testament to the biological consequences of the Habsburg obsession with keeping their bloodline pure. To understand Felipe Prospero's tragedy, we must first grasp the world that created him. The Spanish Empire of the 1650s was still the most powerful force on earth, controlling vast territories across Europe, the Americas, and beyond. Spanish gold flowed from New World mines in seemingly endless streams, funding armies that could crush any rival and palaces that made other monarchs weep with envy. Yet beneath this glittering surface, the empire was rotting from within, and nowhere was this decay more visible than in the royal family itself. The Habsburgs had ruled Spain for over a century by the time Felipe Próspero was born, and they had maintained their grip on power through a strategy that seemed brilliant, but would prove catastrophic. They married almost exclusively within their own family. Cousins wed cousins, uncles married nieces, and aunts became wives to their nephews. This wasn't mere preference. It was calculated policy designed to prevent Spanish wealth and territory from flowing to foreign dynasties through marriage alliances. What the Habsburg advisors failed to understand was that they were conducting a genetic experiment that would produce increasingly horrifying results with each generation. By Felipe Prospero's time, the Spanish royal family tree looked less like a tree and more like a tangled knot, with the same names appearing over and over again as ancestors became descendants in an endless cycle of biological repetition. Felipe Próspero was born into this nightmare on November 28, 1657, the son of King Philip IV of Spain and his second wife, Mariana of Austria. But calling Mariana his stepmother would be misleading. She was also his niece, being the daughter of Philip's sister. This wasn't unusual by Habsburg standards. It was simply the latest iteration of a breeding strategy that had produced increasingly fragile offspring for decades. From the moment of his birth, it was clear that something was terribly wrong with the infant prince. He emerged into the world already bearing the physical marks of his cursed inheritance: a severely deformed jaw that made eating difficult, a body so weak that he could barely support his own head, and those haunting eyes that seemed to see far too much for such a young soul. Palace physicians, sworn to secrecy about the heir's condition, worked desperately to find treatments for ailments they couldn't even properly diagnose. The baby prince's arrival should have been cause for celebration throughout the Spanish Empire. After all, Philip IV had desperately needed a male heir after the death of his son Baltasar Carlos in 1646. Instead, Felipe Prospero's birth brought only whispered concerns and carefully concealed horror. Those who saw the infant knew immediately that this child would never grow up to rule an empire. The question wasn't whether he would survive to adulthood. It was how long his tortured body could sustain life at all. Contemporary medical records, preserved in the Spanish Royal Archives, paint a disturbing picture of Felipe Prospero's early years. He suffered from chronic seizures that would leave him unconscious for hours, his tiny body convulsing with frightening intensity. His digestive system was so compromised that he could barely process food, leading to severe malnutrition despite the best efforts of royal physicians. Most disturbing of all were the episodes where the young prince would stare into empty space for extended periods, his eyes focused on something that others couldn't see. Palace servants, already superstitious by nature, began whispering that the prince could see the spirits of dead Habsburg ancestors who had come to claim him. These weren't merely the fantasies of uneducated workers. Even educated courtiers reported feeling an overwhelming sense of dread when left alone with the child. There was something profoundly unsettling about Felipe Prospero's presence that transcended his obvious physical ailments. The prince's mother, Queen Mariana, became increasingly obsessed with finding a cure for her son's condition. She consulted not only the finest physicians in Spain, but also sought help from religious mystics, folk healers, and even practitioners of more questionable arts. Palace records document payments to dozens of supposed miracle workers who promised to restore the prince's health through various treatments ranging from blessed relics to exotic potions imported from the far reaches of the Spanish Empire. Nothing worked. If anything, Felipe Prospero's condition seemed to worsen with each passing month. The political implications of Felipe Prospero's condition were staggering. European courts, always alert to shifts in power, began receiving reports about the Spanish heir's health through their networks of spies and diplomats. While official communications maintained the fiction that the prince was developing normally, private correspondents told a different story. Foreign ambassadors wrote coded letters describing a child so obviously doomed that betting pools were established in some courts regarding how long he might survive. King Philip IV, now in his 50s and acutely aware that time was running out for his dynasty, found himself trapped in an impossible situation. He couldn't acknowledge his son's condition without undermining Spanish prestige, yet he also couldn't ignore the reality that Felipe Próspero would never be able to rule. The king's own health was declining rapidly, aged beyond his years by the stresses of governing a vast empire and watching his family line crumble before his eyes. The court painters who were commissioned to create official portraits of Felipe Próspero faced an unprecedented challenge. How do you capture the likeness of a royal heir while concealing the obvious signs of his genetic catastrophe? Most artists chose to paint the prince from a distance or in profile, minimizing the impact of his disturbing gaze and deformed features. Only Velázquez had the courage, or perhaps the cruel honesty, to paint Felipe Próspero exactly as he appeared, creating an image that would haunt viewers for centuries to come. The portrait session itself became legendary among court insiders for all the wrong reasons. Velázquez, by then the most celebrated artist in Spain, approached the commission with his characteristic unflinching realism, but what he encountered in the royal chambers defied even his extensive experience painting the Habsburg family. Felipe Próspero couldn't stand for more than a few minutes without collapsing, his frail legs buckling under the weight of his oversized head. The artist was forced to work in brief sessions, capturing fragments of the prince's appearance between episodes of exhaustion and those terrifying vacant stares. Palace attendants later described how Velázquez would emerge from these sessions visibly shaken, his usual composed demeanor cracked by prolonged exposure to the prince's unsettling presence. The master painter, who had captured the likenesses of kings and queens with masterful confidence, found himself struggling to complete a portrait of a 4-year-old child. Some courtiers whispered that Velázquez had initially planned to flatter the prince's appearance, as was customary with royal portraits, but found himself compelled by some invisible force to paint only the brutal truth. The finished work revealed details that even the most observant courtiers had failed to notice. Felipe Prospero's hands, barely visible beneath layers of ornate clothing, were twisted into unnatural positions. His stance, carefully supported by furniture and architectural elements, couldn't disguise the fact that the child could barely maintain his balance. Most disturbing of all were those eyes, not just empty, but seemingly ancient, as if the soul behind them had experienced centuries of suffering in just 4 short years of life. When the portrait was finally unveiled to the royal court, the reaction was immediate and visceral. Several ladies-in-waiting reportedly fainted upon seeing their prince captured with such devastating honesty. King Philip IV, already struggling with his own declining health and the weight of imperial responsibility, stood before the painting in complete silence for nearly an hour. Contemporary accounts suggest the king wept openly, not from joy at seeing his son immortalized by Spain's greatest artist, but from the crushing realization that the portrait confirmed what everyone had been too terrified to acknowledge. The diplomatic consequences were swift and merciless. Within weeks of the portrait's completion, ambassadors from France, Austria, and other major European powers were sending encrypted reports back to their sovereigns. The coded language couldn't disguise the essential message. The Spanish succession was doomed. Felipe Próspero, even if he survived to adulthood, would never be capable of ruling the vast Habsburg territories. The balance of power that had defined European politics for over a century was about to shift dramatically. Foreign courts began making contingency plans with ruthless efficiency. Marriage alliances were quietly reconsidered, trade agreements were subtly modified, and military strategists started drawing up scenarios for a Europe without Spanish dominance. The portrait of a dying child had inadvertently triggered a diplomatic revolution that would reshape the continent's political landscape within decades. Meanwhile, within the Spanish court itself, the atmosphere grew increasingly desperate and surreal. Queen Mariana, driven to near madness by her son's condition, began consulting increasingly exotic sources of supposed wisdom. Palace records document payments to mystics from the Americas who claimed indigenous knowledge could heal the prince, to scholars who promised that ancient Roman texts contained forgotten medical secrets, and even to individuals who claimed direct communication with saints and angels. Felipe Próspero died on November 1, 1661, just days before his 4th birthday. The prince who had haunted the Spanish court with his dead eyes finally found the peace that had eluded him in life. His death marked more than the end of a tragic existence. It signaled the beginning of the end for the Spanish Habsburg dynasty itself. When you look at Velázquez's portrait today, you're not just seeing a sickly child in royal robes. You're witnessing the final horrifying consequence of absolute power turned inward upon itself. consuming the very bloodline it sought to preserve. Felipe Prospero's legacy lives on as a chilling reminder that even empires that span the globe can be destroyed by the monsters they create within their own palaces.